Chapter 6, in which Oscar discovers the hotel's dining room resembles an inverted latrine, before meeting a concierge who's convinced it's a brilliant marketing opportunity. Inside the hotel, both cats realise the second autumn would not be forgotten in a hurry. Paws over their noses, they stared in disbelief at the mess. The foyer smelt like greasy cheese mixed with sweet and sick. From its ceiling, chunks of plaster fell in response to patrons' frantic retrieval of luggage upstairs. Wallpaper peeled, congealing in thick, soggy lumps and looking like a sneeze from something large and infectious. Pot plants were little more than singed sticks in withered soil, and furnishings looked as though they'd been gone over with a blowtorch and blunted cutlery. Remnants of tattered cordon hung from the ceiling like streamers designed to celebrate nothing, while other bits remained glue across the walls like toilet paper besieged. Picking their way across a floor that could only be described as highly flammable, they edged toward the dining room. With his scarf positioned as it had been the night before, Oscar made his way with morbid fascination, while the Derby followed in chokes of untold disbelief. Peering within, they saw it had fared even worse than the foyer. With muffled obscenities, Oscar pushed the dining room door, which fell from what remained of hinge and splattered to the floor, before sinking. He tried to say something, but gagged. Lost for words, the Derby did the same. The table, having broken in two, appeared to have been cast in plaster, albeit brown and lumpy. Singed wallpaper peeled in curls around crusting lumps of splattered manure. Chairs lay scattered across the room, thrown when diners fled across a sick-soaked floor. Paw marks streaked through oily, sludge-splattered tables, and a mound of poo steamed near the doorway, presumably deposited while slippery paws grappled with dining room doors. The guilt was all too much for the Derby, and she turned to retch, hoiking up a mouthful of sick, which she dribbled onto similar excretions congealed upon the floor. "Can I help you?" a voice asked pleasantly. Both cats turned, the Derby pretending she'd been putting something in, rather than letting something out of her mouth. A little dog in a neat Hotel Ruen waistcoat, with a name tag saying Percival S. Minton, looked at them, eager to offer assistance. "Would you like a room?" he asked, in a manner unbefitting the state of venue. "I beg your pardon," said Oscar, noticing the dog's paws were covered in excrement, something that didn't appear to perturb the animal. "A room. Would you like one?" Oscar and the Derby looked at each other, and then at the dog, who clearly wished to make their stay as pleasant as possible. But before Oscar could reply, the lift on the foyer's far side pinged. From it tumbled several sobbing animals, clutching half-packed suitcases. Dashing for the exit, one screamed at another who'd lost a sock to leave it, for goodness sakes, just blooming well leave it," before flinging themselves from the hotel. "It's just that we have some vacancies at the moment," the little dog continued, turning back to the cats. The Derby, overwhelmed with guilt, groaned at such unjust courtesy. "Are you in charge here?" Oscar asked. The little dog nodded, having been given a promotion he was not in the least expecting. "I am a hospital patron and logistical support assistant." They blinked at him. "I collect bags," he explained. "Moreover, I am currently the only member of staff present, as all the others are either crying, mute, or in hospital. Which is quite all right, because so far I've only had to manage patrons checking out, and doing so hasn't involved any bookwork per se, and more my ability to catch flying keys." In convenient illustration, one of the escapees returned and hurled a key across the foyer, which landed beside Percival in some drying lumps of sick. Picking it up, he waved a pleasant thank you to the already absconded patron. He wiped it on his paw and wandered to a reception desk. Oscar and the Derby followed. "You can't seriously think animals will want rooms here after all this," Oscar said. Percival placed the key upon a full rack of others and returned to them. "Well, why not?" Lost for words, Oscar raised his paws at the congealing filth around them. Blinking at it, the little dog said, "But it's ambience." While Oscar stared, Percival smiled, waiting for the next round of pleasant conversation. "This isn't ambience, this is disgusting," Oscar cried. "You can't offer room while the hotel's in this sort of state. This is the single most revolting state of affairs I have ever had the misfortune of witnessing." He turned to the Derby. "No offence." But she shrugged, quite agreeing with him. The little dog leant upon his desk. "When one has been in the hotel game for as long as I have, one learns to take advantage of changing circumstance. You see, I don't believe in misfortune, only missed fortune." "Missed fortune," Oscar repeated flatly. Percival nodded. "In this business, nothing is more invigorating than change. Getting the pot stirred, if you will. Such change needs to be embraced. One needs to work with it and evolve the management model. One needs to seize opportunity and move forward in order to stay ahead of competition." He winked at the two cats. "Moving forward is the best way to get closure." Appalled at such a stupid choice of words, Oscar asked with a patience forced, "Does your business model take into account that no other hotel in Ruen currently has their interior draped in thick curtains of erupted feces?" The little dog winked again. "Ambience." And reaching for an appointment book, he said, "Apparently it's all about seeing things differently, which is the best way of getting closure." "Please don't say that." The little dog looked up. "Say what?" "That stupid expression, getting closure." "Why not?" "Because it makes you sound like a door." The animal shrugged before offering him the appointment book with a pen. "What's this?" Oscar asked, not believing he was being offered a room after all. "I thought you wanted a room." "No, Percival, I do not want a room." "Oh." Crestfallen, the little dog retracted the pen and slumped behind his desk. Eyes misty, he sighed in a sort of generic surrender. Oscar glanced at the Derby, who indicated she was not getting involved, having done quite enough already. With a sigh, he turned back to the bereft animal, who was either dreadfully naive or so inexperienced that he'd resorted to some appalling textbook on hotel management as a means to cope. "Look," Oscar said, "I don't need a room here because I already have one." "You do?" Oscar nodded. Percival held out his paw for yet another return of key. "But I don't want to return my key," Oscar assured him, "because my room is very nice. It has a nice view and even the window frame is nice. In fact, I would like to keep my room and indeed go to it now." "You wish to stay?" Percival whispered, astonished. Oscar nodded again. The little dog, thrilled beyond remark, agreed wholeheartedly about the window frame in particular. With a flurry through the appointment book, he insisted that not only would Oscar be Hotel Ruen's guest of honour, but would apparently be the hotel's only guest. "Would you like room service?" Percival asked, following them across the sticky floor toward the lifts. No." "Are you quite certain? I can easily get the kitchen fired up, wipe down a few saucepans and maybe wash a couple of mugs." "Thank you, but that won't be at all necessary," Oscar said, pressing at the lift call button hesitantly, certain it was also coated in a film of poo. "And I'd be extremely cautious about firing up anything in that kitchen if I were you, unless you're planning on demolishing the place and starting again from scratch." When the lift opened, they were surprised to see another group of sobbing animals, who also clutched hastily packed luggage. Embarrassed, their sobbing ceased and they found an intrigue with their suitcases they ought to have found when packing the things. Sliding past the cats, they mumbled awkwardly and hurried across the foyer, but not before hurling a key at Percival. Once in his room, Oscar demanded explanation for the devastation downstairs. Appalled herself, the Derby was grateful for the opportunity. "What, in the name of all things fluffy, did you do, the Derby?" he cried. "Never have I seen anything so disgusting, with the possible exception of my bathtub on Wednesdays." "Thick canisters of what we call powder pop," she said, in a peculiar mixture of relief and pride. "A device used to liberally distribute fermenting content via a timed pressure seal. I have a talent for mixing special turgid ingredients, you see, which when confined produce enormous pressure from fermentation, the consequence of which is rapid depressurization and disintegration of the canister, and flings their liquefied contents before rapidly solidifying again. A physical chemist then, Oscar said sourly. Hardly, though it's something I've always found fascinating. But I've already told you, my protests have never been this devastating, and had opportunity not been so rushed, I would certainly have anticipated its severity and never have agreed. Oscar was becoming accustomed to the rain of spittle the more impassioned she became. Opening the window, he hoped the breeze might steer her lisp from him. Should she become more ardent, he might require a hat. Don't you see, she implored, such ingredients are not for effect alone, but instead symbolic, for there is method to this madness. Method? He scoffed. Are you quite certain of that? She took a step closer, her expression fervent, a double whammy as far as Oscar was concerned, and he took 2 steps backwards to compensate. What is the one thing uniting us and them? She urged. The one thing animals of all ages have in common. Fortunately, there were not too many S's toward the end of her question, and, although he needed answers, Oscar was reluctant to encourage any in such a confined space. He took a step sideways and met a chair. We all need to go to the loo, she answered for him. We all need to poo. Such acts of graffiti or powder pops are simply means to prove that there is nothing that elevates the ruling council from us. Now wait a minute, said Oscar, waving his paw to defend against spittle. Don't include me in this, the Derby. I'm just visiting, remember? He slid the chair further along the wall as an excuse to move out of range. No, you're not, she said, turning to follow. You're here on Curiosa, remember? You've been ordered to help sort this mess out. She tried to sound commanding, but both knew it was plead. Well, I may have been, but ridding Ruen of the lead troublemaker would manage precisely that. The very animal I have isolated here in this room, in fact. How do you know I haven't already contacted the police and they're not on their way here now? It almost sounded plausible. Folding his paws, he pretended this had been his plan all along. The Derby watched him, her eyes narrow in consideration. What makes you think I would let you? His stance wasn't fooling either of them, so he gave up and sat on the bed instead. Well, I don't think it would make any difference anyway, he said. As Ruen's police are the most incompetent I've ever seen, frankly, they're about as much use as a bell on a Rottweiler. The Derby said nothing. I mean, I have never, in all my days of abundant fluffiness, witnessed such a blatant lack of skill. Your police chief, the Derby, is the single most useless animal I have ever met. He poked himself with a paw, adding, even I would be better at sorting out that mess, and you have no idea what that is suggesting. The police chief is my father, though he does have a very nice white hat, very white actually. Goodness, it's white. He must keep it well brushed, I imagine. Does he have some sort of hat brushing kit at home when the whiteness becomes, well, not quite so white? The Derby glared for a moment, but then sat on the bed beside him. No, you're quite right, she said with a sigh. He's about as competent as you're driving. Oscar humphed, and then thought for a time. So that's why you were at the police station this morning, he realised. Not turning yourself in, so much as needing his comfort, without knowing how to tell him what you'd done. She nodded and looked at the floor. He was promoted to chief 10 years ago, she said, and at the time, Ruen's crime rate, although always low, suddenly disappeared. She shook her head. I could never understand it myself. Who on earth would promote him if he's so hopeless? Well, the ruling council, of course. Oscar stood then, paced and fluffed his deflated pantaloons. Actually, that makes a great deal of sense, the Derby, and may explain why Ruen has such a low crime rate despite having incompetent police. Criminals are not tolerated in Ruen, she said. It's as simple as that. Yes, my point entirely. How can that be if the police are hopeless? And further, why are you still tolerated, if the ruling council is so set against your protests. If they can eradicate crime, they should certainly be able to eradicate you." The Dervy shrugged. "I'd suggest you're permitted to continue your fight, the Dervy, because your father is being controlled by the council." "What, you mean blackmail?" She stood, but then doubled over in pain. "What's wrong?" Oscar asked, helping her back to the bed. "My paw," she grimaced. "I think it's broken." "What? When?" "Oh, I don't know. Let me think. Perhaps when I threw myself off a cliff." "Well, you didn't say anything before," Oscar said, noticing her hind paw was indeed swollen. "It hurt, but I could still stand on it, but not now." "We need to get you to a hospital." "No," she cried, grabbing his collar. "Not a hospital." The last words, containing an S and uttered in desperation, left him quite drenched. "The Dervy," he said damply, wiping himself with a paw. "You can't leave your paw like this. It needs to be treated." "If I go to hospital, my father would certainly be informed, and he mustn't know of my crimes today." It was true. Both needed to avoid advertising their spree of carnage and theft. "I have a better idea," Oscar said, and looked around to find some towels. "Clean yourself up." "Why?" "Because I have been invited to dinner this evening by a retired doctor who will certainly know what to do. Moreover, he wishes to show me something curious, something which, under the circumstances, I suspect will probably interest you as well." "Which doctor?" she asked, taking a towel he threw on the bed. Oscar smiled and said, "He is a doctor who I think you'll be both appalled and delighted to meet." It was already dark when they arrived at Horace's house. Having dragged the Dervy to the door, Oscar rang the bell. When Horace answered, the Dervy collapsed into his hallway, dragging Oscar in after her, which resulted in a far less dignified arrival than he'd intended. At the end of the hallway, Bremble appeared, drying her paws upon a dishcloth. Her smile of welcome soon dissolved to concern, however, and she hurried to the cats. "I'm sorry to trouble you," Oscar said, picking himself up. "But this is my friend, the Dervy, who has, I fear, broken her paw." While Horace blinked, Bremble held no such hesitation. "You poor animal," she said. "Don't put any weight on it, my dear, and let us carry you." The three animals picked her up and shuffled her in awkward scaffold down the hall and into the sitting room. "Take her other paw, Hory, and Oscar, if you would be so kind, perhaps you could pile some cushions in front of the green chair." Oscar did so, and Horace and Bremble lowered the cat into it. After raising her hind paw upon the cushions, Bremble left to find some bandages. "She had a fall earlier today, Horace," Oscar said, "but she didn't mention her discomfort until some time later."
"Does it hurt here, my dear?"
Horace asked, pressing at her paw.
"A little." "And here?"
"Yes." Horace stood.
"It is swollen, yes, but fortunately it is not broken."